What is money? It's a simple question, right? The stuff in your wallet, the number in your bank account. It serves as a tool of trade, a store of value, and a unit of account. We learn its value from a young age, what a dollar can buy, what a quarter is worth. But we almost never learn its history. We don't learn about the shells, the salt, or the giant stone discs on the island of Yap. We don't learn about the shift from gold-backed promises to pure government fiat currency. In many cases, we accept the system we're born into as a fixed, unchangeable reality. This simple question, what is money, is at the heart of a new experiment taking place not in a bank or on Wall Street, but in El Salvador. In April 2025, in the coastal region of La Libertad, the government began a new pilot program. It was small, encompassing just 50 schools and about 1,000 children. It's a social studies course, 3 hours a week, focused on the history of money and financial literacy. And after laying that foundation, it presents Bitcoin as a normalized, modern example. To a global audience that largely views Bitcoin as a defunct, volatile, speculative asset that somehow is worth billions. However, the curriculum frames its inclusion not as a quick money scheme, but rather as a fundamental skill for modern living. To understand why this is such a seismic move, we need to zoom out. Way out. This isn't just a story about a country and a cryptocurrency. It's a story about national identity, economic desperation, geopolitical chess, and a government betting, quite literally, on the minds of the next generation. First, we need to lay some foundation, as El Salvador's relationship with money is complicated. For decades, the nation's economic reality has been defined by two powerful external forces. The first is a violent past. A brutal civil war from 1979 to 1992 tore El Salvador apart and triggered a mass exodus, primarily to the United States. The second is the consequence of that exodus: remittances. El Salvador's civil war was a 12-year conflict. It was fought between the US-backed, military-led government and a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups known as the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN for short. The roots of the war were a result of decades of political and economic inequality. A small elite owned most of the land, particularly for coffee production, while the vast majority of the population lived in poverty with little political power. Resistance had been ongoing, with a notable example taking place in La Matanza in 1932, when the army killed thousands after a peasant uprising. This happened alongside the rise of Orden, a state-backed paramilitary group that surveilled and repressed rural communities. Efforts to reform this corrupt system were often met with violent suppression. This all led to a break on October 15, 1979, when junior officers overthrew Carlos Humberto Romero and installed a civilian military junta that promised reforms and, on paper, dissolved Orden. In practice, repression continued under a state of siege, and Orden's rural network flowed into the state's civil defense units and allied death squads. On the 23rd of March, 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero ended his homily with a plea. "In the name of God, I beseech you, I implore you. In the name of God, I command you, stop the repression." He was assassinated the next day while saying Mass. It was this and other repressions that saw 5 insurgent groups unite into the FMLN in October of that same year. On December 2nd, 1980, members of the National Guard arrested 4 churchwomen and took them to an isolated spot where they were shot dead at close range. In retaliation, the FMLN launched a nationwide offensive in January 1981, marking the shift from intermittent repression to open war. They opposed the Army, the National Guard, the Treasury Police, the National Police, and pro-government militias, as the junta failed to rein in his security forces, and civilians were the ones who paid the price. The war's worst massacre came at El Mazote in December 1981, where the US-trained Atlacatl Battalion killed villagers during Operación Rescate. The Truth Commissioner's summary after the war was stark, and I just want you to listen to the horrors it describes. During the morning, they proceeded to interrogate, torture, and execute the men in various locations. Around noon, they began taking out the women in groups, separating them from their children and machine gunning them. Finally, they killed the children. A group of children who had been locked in the convent were machine gunned through the windows. After exterminating the entire population, the soldiers set fire to the buildings. By the end of the war, about 75,000 people were dead, and more than 1 million displaced. The conflict formally ended with the Chapultepec Peace Accords on January 16, 1992, which demobilized the FMLN, reformed the armed forces and police, and created a UN Truth Commission that found that most documented abuses were by the state agents and allied death squads like the ones mentioned before. The conflict left a legacy of trauma and a deep-seated public distrust of institutions. It also triggered a mass exodus of Salvadorians fleeing from the violence. The displacement caused by the war created a new and permanent economic reality. Those who fled established lives abroad, primarily in the United States, and began sending money back home to support families they had left behind. Over time, these cash transfers, known as remittances, evolved from a temporary support mechanism into one of the most critical sectors of the Salvadorian national economy. According to data collected by the World Bank, remittances have consistently accounted for over 20% of El Salvador's yearly GDP over the last decade and a half. In 2024, this figure reached 24% of the GDP. To put that figure into perspective, it means that the money sent home from abroad is a larger contributor to the national economy than agriculture, industry, and manufacturing. This level of dependency is exceptionally rare. Among all global nations, only a handful, like Tonga or Haiti, have a higher reliance on remittances. This dependency creates a unique set of economic vulnerabilities. The financial stability of the country is directly tied to the economic health of the United States. A recession there means less work and smaller paychecks for Salvadorian immigrants, which translates immediately to less money flowing into the Salvadorian households. This means that the nation's economic fate is, to a significant degree, outsourced. In addition, this lifeblood of the national economy flows through a narrow and costly pipeline. The market for sending this money is dominated by a few large money transfer operators, primarily Western Union and MoneyGram. The cost of sending money across borders has decreased over the last few years due to competition and changes in technology, but it still remains significant. The average fee for sending remittances to South America changes by country. However, in January 2024, the average cost of sending $200 American to Latin America and the Caribbean was 3.89%. For low-income families, that's a $10 to $12 fee, a recurring expense that adds up to a substantial sum over a year. This fee structure functions as a de facto regressive tax. It is a cost levied not on wealth or income, but on the act of survival itself, disproportionately affecting poorer households for whom every dollar sent is already carefully allocated for essentials like food, rent, or medicine. The system, by its very architecture, extracts value from the poor and transfers it to large, multinational financial corporations every single time a family needs to access their own money. These issues of highly taxed funds and labor outside the country are the problems the Salvadorian government has sought to address with what is arguably one of the most audacious economic policies of the 21st century so far. In September 2021, President Nayib Bukele's government passed the Bitcoin law, making Bitcoin legal tender alongside the US dollar. For regular Salvadorians, it mostly meant a new option at checkout and for remittances. You could pay or get paid in Bitcoin and convert them to dollars if you preferred. Aside from addressing the earlier problem, a tweet from President Bukele states, approximately 70% of the population in El Salvador does not have a bank account. Essentially, this would give them a way to pay for things without going through traditional banks. The international response was a chorus of disbelief. The IMF issued warnings. Credit rating agencies frowned. And economists on Twitter, well, they did what they do best. Amidst the global dismissal, the experiment's true verdict came not from the economists, but from the Salvadorian people themselves. This became unbearably clear in a deep dive study from Yale School of Management. The study's central finding was simple. A lack of trust caused the use of the cryptocurrency to fall off quickly. The government tried to counter this with a $30 bonus for downloading something called a Chivo wallet, basically where they keep their money, and initially, the numbers looked promising. Research showed 68% of households became aware of the Chivo wallet, and 78% of those downloaded it. However, the initial surge was misleading. The data shows a quick drop-off, with only 20% of initial users continuing to use the Chivo wallet after spending their $30 bonus, and mainly for transactions in US dollars. Less than 10% continue to use it in transactions in Bitcoin, which the government hoped they would adopt. As a result, it became clear the public only saw the Chivo wallet more like a one-time coupon or bursary, not as a financial tool they should use in their day-to-day lives. And when asked why they rejected the app, the top reason was a legacy rooted in their recent past, namely that users prefer to use cash and hold a mistrust of speculative assets. For a population that lived through so much violence followed by a banking crisis, the tangible US dollar represented a hard-won stability. A volatile digital asset, by contrast, felt like a step backwards towards uncertainty. So, by most metrics, the grand Bitcoin experiment had failed. It didn't cause hyperinflation or economic collapse, but it didn't trigger a miraculous economic boom either. Over the last 5 years, it's basically just been there humming away in the background.
Come on! Do math!
Moving forward to today, it makes this new move to double down by introducing Bitcoin into the school curriculum an odd choice. Likely, the government realized they couldn't just force adoption onto skeptical adults that remembered the instability of the past. So they decided to play the long game. The very long game. They're not trying to convince the parents. They're building a new reality in the minds of their children.
I'm pretty sure this is going to work.
As even more ambitious.
We'll send to Congress a bill that will make receiving remittances with.
The story of Bitcoin and education in El Salvador begins not in a government office, but in a small coastal town named El Zonte, under a project called Bitcoin Beach. Starting in 2019, the grassroots project was launched with the intention of creating the world's first Bitcoin-based circular economy. An anonymous donation of Bitcoin funded the initiative, which paid young locals in Bitcoin for community work like cleaning beaches. The project's leaders, like local economist Mike Peterson, claim they see Bitcoin as a practical tool for financial inclusion. To make it work, they had to teach everyone how to use Bitcoin first. Per their own document, they found that nothing beats showing kids how to use Bitcoin in the simplest way possible, like doing so in person. They focused on creating what they call a light bulb moment, believing that people need to do their first transaction before they are willing to put in the effort required to understand Bitcoin. The experiment, which allowed people to pay for everything from utility bills to food with Bitcoin, proved the concept on a local scale and directly inspired the government's decision to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. Inspired by the growing Bitcoin movement, a separate nonprofit called Me Primer Bitcoin, or My First Bitcoin, was formed to focus on formal education, using its platform to differentiate itself from institutions functioning under the currently failing Bitcoin law. In 2021, they got their start teaching 400 students. However, their big break came in April 2022, when they launched a 10-week education program at a public school in San Marcos. This initiative marked the first Bitcoin diploma program taught in a public school anywhere in the world. The initial pilot ended in June 2022, with 38 students graduating posing for photos with their so-called Bitcoin diplomas. The success of this pilot and the proven model of Bitcoin Beach caught the attention of the national government. In September 2023, on the 2-year anniversary of the Bitcoin law, the Ministry of Education moved from the sidelines to directly partner with these organizations. The state did not overtly design its own curriculum from scratch. Instead, it adopted the Me Primer Bitcoin's open source workbook as the primary source material for its own national Bitcoin diploma. Through a different pilot program, My First Bitcoin, Bitcoin Beach, and other organizations began training 150 local school teachers, who then returned to their own schools to teach the new curriculum. By 2024, the initiative had scaled up dramatically. The program was training 700 additional public school teachers with the goal of bringing, quote, quality Bitcoin education to every school in El Salvador within 2 years. The program has also exploded beyond El Salvador's borders. The open source workbook developed by My First Bitcoin has been translated into 12 languages and is being taught by grassroots projects in over 20 countries, meaning the idea of teaching about crypto in schools is picking up steam. That brings us to this year. In April 2025, the Ministry of Education launched its new program in the coastal region of La Libertad, bringing Bitcoin education to 50 schools and to about 1,000 children. Each week, students now spend 3 hours in a social studies class that culminates not in civics or geography, but in a lesson about cryptocurrency. The launch was a carefully staged affair, held at the National Library. Rows of children sat with cartoon-covered workbooks, while the National Bitcoin Office recorded footage for social media. Parents were invited to weekend sessions to ensure the program extended beyond the classroom and into households. However, this raises an important question. What exactly are these children learning? Well, it begins at age 7, when students are introduced to classroom texts illustrated by Lena Seisch, a Western German designer best known for creating the cartoon The Little Hodler. These are a series of tongue-in-cheek comics and cartoons originally drawn for crypto enthusiasts that are now being repurposed for national educational materials. As mascots for Bitcoin, their playful eyes, bright pastel colors, and simple outlines make the subject seem harmless. And they are, as their cuteness is what makes them effective in children's storybooks.
So I named the book, What is Money? Because that is at the core of everything. Money is about different things. It's about value. You know, what is the difference between something valuable and something expensive? What do I need and what do I want? These are all the little questions that help you understand why we use money and what we use it for and how it comes together. So our books, actually the first 2 books, they talk not about Bitcoin specifically. Before we can even get to that point, we have to help the kids understand basic concepts.
Despite the government's apparent transparency regarding the intentions behind the Bitcoin subjects, their presentation hides the fact that the comics and the rest of their materials do not simply explain how money works, but instead tell students who deserves trust and who does not. Take the strip titled None of Your Business. The Orange Hodler character faces endless questions about their intentions and uses for Bitcoin. All the while, the same person asking the questions, with the United Nations flag and suit, stands in front of a pile of money labeled taxes, dismissing the same questions with the line, "That's none of your business." It frames traditional institutions as opaque and authoritarian, while Bitcoin is positioned as the transparent, honest victim. Another comic, When Bitcoin Dips, divides the world into three roles. The pre-coiner, who, because of their hesitation, always misses out on investing in Bitcoin. The no-coiner, who mocks from the sidelines and keeps thinking Bitcoin is a fad despite constantly being proven wrong. And the Bitcoiner, who is praised for calmly repeating the same mantra to hold and buy again, regardless of price movements. On social media, the exaggeration works as satire, but in a workbook where students are absorbing knowledge, the lesson reads very differently. Doubt is portrayed as weakness, skepticism is mocked as ignorance, and the only acceptable stance is unwavering loyalty to Bitcoin. A third strip, called Bitcoin Not Crypto, sharpens the message even further. Other coins are drawn as collapsing in flames, while Bitcoin alone remains standing. And the phrase, "Bitcoin is the future," is presented as a simple truth. In the setting of a national school book, this creates a false choice, suggesting that one technology represents success, while every alternative represents failure. Together, these comics simplify global debates about finance and technology into a set of morality plays. They reduce institutions to comic villains, skeptics to fools, and Bitcoin to the unquestioned hero. El Salvador promotes this as financial literacy, yet the motive could be read as normalizing distrust of public systems while presenting devotion to one asset as a civic duty. The structure of the pilot ensures this is not simply passing exposure. The Education Ministry has confirmed that the sequence of lessons will continue into grades 4, 5, and 6, reinforcing the same messages year after year. By the time the students reach secondary school, the mascots are replaced with the My First Bitcoin diploma, which is now built around the state-approved Fanzia Economia, or Finance and Economy curriculum. It's a 32-week program built on 4 key topics: personal finance, entrepreneurship, productivity training, and Bitcoin. The program starts with fundamental questions that economists have been debating for centuries, such as what creates value and how societies determine what something is worth. The curriculum introduces students to the mechanics of modern finance systems, from personal budgets to broader forces shaping economies. The material presents money not as a static concept, but as an evolving technology. Only after exploring all this does the program introduce Bitcoin and blockchain as a modern step in the history of money. Against the backdrop of shells, metal, and paper, the concept of purely digital money becomes less abstract. During lessons, students run buy-and track simulations, study basic Bitcoin economics, and cover rules, regulations, and security. These focuses loop back into the wider coursework through entrepreneurship tasks like short pitches and productivity work that focuses on habits, ensuring that technology is treated as a tool within broader financial settings and professional skills. At the university level, the path narrows even further through Cubo Plus, a program designed to supply innovators to feed the growing need for Bitcoin specialists. Financial scholarships bring a small cohort of students into intensive Bitcoin and Lightning training, providing stipends and industry mentorship through industrial funders. These programs are less about general education and more about creating a pipeline of developers whose professional identity is built around the same asset children learn about as cartoons. For those who reach this stage, the reliance, association, and most importantly, normalization of Bitcoin will likely have hardened over years of exposure. I need to stress that this rollout has been careful and deliberate. Mascots win the attention of primary students, repeated lessons build habit in middle school, national diplomas frame the ideology in secondary education, and scholarships push a few students into Bitcoin specialization. This strategy stands in contrast to the failed Chivo wallet, which adults quickly abandoned after collecting their $30 bonus. Children, however, are treated differently. By embedding Bitcoin into the same classroom that teaches multiplication tables and national history, the ministry cultivates loyalty and familiarity long before skepticism has a chance to take root. By placing Bitcoin at the heart of education, Bukele's regime transformed the classroom into a site of ideological encoding. Researcher Tobias Booz from the Department of Political Science at the University of Virginia notes that Bukele weaves the promise and techno-utopian ideology surrounding Bitcoin into classic populist narratives, constructing a populist myth of himself as a tech-savvy visionary. Through the educational materials that we already covered, which depict Bitcoin as heroic and institutions as villainous, the regime normalizes its core narrative among children before they can become critical consumers of policy or media. Such scheming functions as a conduit for favoring cronies close to the president, thereby elevating their wealth and influence. Controlling the story at home brings a number of benefits, namely that it helps the government look more legitimate to its own people and investors. Should volatility, losses, or fiscal strain make Bitcoin a liability, the regime can point to a population already inculcated with the idea that Bitcoin was always the natural evolution of money and everything is to be expected. In this sense, the educational framing acts as a reputational reserve. Researchers studying the policy in the Journal of Latin America interpret this as a public relations tool to capture new support from like-minded constituencies, build closer relationships with them, and empower international, quote, crypto bros. This curriculum also becomes a pipeline for elite capture. Students who complete the Bitcoin diplomas, master the regime's sanctioned narrative, and enter technical or institutional roles eventually become human capital aligned with Bukele's project. Over time, dissent is less likely among these individuals whose professional futures depend on Bitcoin's continuance. When viewed through that lens, this form of education is not just about recruitment, but about integrating loyalty into the structure of governance. Another major red flag is that curricular framing delegitimizes rivals and alternative narratives. This is particularly noticeable in the comics, where skeptics are infantilized, traditional monetary institutions are caricatured, and dissenters are made to look foolish. By closing off critical perspectives in early education, the regime shifts future contestation. Given these issues, the International Monetary Fund has publicly emphasized the need for guardrails. In 2023, the IMF warned that given the legal risks, fiscal fragility, and largely speculative nature of crypto markets, the authorities should reconsider their plans to expand government exposures to Bitcoin, plainly saying that financing purchases of Bitcoin by issuing tokenized securities should be eschewed because of the financial risks. Later, in 2024, the IMF added that further efforts are needed to enhance transparency and mitigate potential fiscal and financial stability risks from the Bitcoin project. These cautions, now on the public record, would be highly relevant in any curriculum that presents Bitcoin as a civic or financial inevitability. To back up their warnings, in March 2025, the IMF approved a 40-month, $1.4 billion program with El Salvador meant to enforce a downgrade of the cryptocurrency status. As part of the agreement to receive the money from the IMF, the government pledged not to accumulate more Bitcoin in the nation's new Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Fund, basically the country's digital rainy day money. As of recording, the Bitcoin reserve contains an estimated 6,102 coins, equal to this number, which is too long for me to read. Reuters reported that as part of the deal, it stipulated that Bitcoin cannot be used to pay taxes and its acceptance by the public is voluntary. In theory, these terms marked a retreat from earlier ambitions of crypto wealth accumulation and, at least on paper, stopped the government from pursuing its agenda publicly by imposing practical boundaries. But domestically, when classrooms continue to treat Bitcoin as the logical conclusion to monetary history, the impression is that acceptance is inevitable rather than voluntary. Not to mention, given the estimated value of the Bitcoin the government already holds, following the IMF's rules would cause serious financial losses. By maintaining an appearance of compliance, the regime is able to outwardly comply with international guardrails while inwardly shaping belief systems that treat Bitcoin as the expected norm. Once the current generation is socialized into a Bitcoin-centric worldview, rollback or moderation becomes politically and symbolically very costly. Attempting to change course would contradict the foundational narrative taught in classrooms and risk being perceived as a betrayal by those whose identities were shaped under the regime's Bitcoin education. In that sense, the curriculum acts as a commitment tying Bukele's future credibility to sustaining the Bitcoin regime. And in a dictatorship, credibility is everything. So, what is the actual goal here? It's far more ambitious than creating a few savvy crypto traders. The government is attempting nothing less than the creation of a Bitcoin generation. These children, who are now in elementary school, will reach maturity in the 2030s and the 2040s. To them, Bitcoin won't be a weird volatile asset spread through dude bros on the internet. It'll be a fundamental part of their financial literacy, as normal as learning about checking accounts or credit cards. The friction, the fear, and the technological barriers that exist today, perhaps the most immediate and transformative benefit lies in the nation's bloodline: remittances. For a population weaned on Bitcoin, the act of sending money home could be revolutionized. Instead of relying on costly middlemen, cross-border payments could become as instant and cheap as sending a text message. Slashing the millions of dollars in tax that remittance fees extract from the economy would mean more money in the pockets of families, directly boosting local purchasing power and stimulating community-level growth. Furthermore, this initiative is a foundational investment in the intelligence of current students. By making financial and digital literacy a core part of the curriculum, El Salvador is not just creating Bitcoin users, it is training a future workforce with a deep knowledge of economics. This foundation enables the country to follow the blueprint of financial hubs like Singapore. It actively cultivates a specialized tech hub, attracts outside investment, and creates high-skilled jobs independent of traditional sectors. This strategy allows the nation to leapfrog over more established systems, much like how Kenya vaulted past physical currency with digital banking, and compete on its own terms in the global digital economy. On a macro level, this is a bold bid for a new form of economic sovereignty. For a nation whose financial stability is tethered to the US dollar and the health of a foreign economy, fostering a parallel, decentralized system is a strategic hedge. A so-called Bitcoin generation could, over time, help diversify the nation's monetary base, reducing its vulnerability to economic shocks and the policies of other nations. In essence, the classroom is a greenhouse for this new economic model. Though risky, the potential payoff is a future where El Salvador is no longer defined by the fees it pays to global financial systems, but rather by the talent and wealth it cultivates from within. The real innovation, then, may not be the adoption of a new asset, but the cultivation of a new mindset. One that sees financial sovereignty not as a policy handed down, but as a skill built up from the first grade. But this all starts with the children. Whether they ultimately embrace Bitcoin, or reject it, or build something better, only time will tell.